Well, good evening, and welcome to the fourth annual Data-Driven Debate. My name is David Iglesias. I'm the director of the Wheaton Center for Faith, Politics, and Economics. I want to first acknowledge the generous donor of all this, George Speak, Wheaton class of 1965, who is here in person. Mr. Speak taught physics, I found out today, at Wheaton College for a couple of years, and then he began a career that ended at Theon, in which he retired a number of years ago. This data-driven debate is in its fourth iteration. Mr. Speak's desire was to create an opportunity for students to develop their abilities to use data-driven analysis in supporting decision-making on critical policy issues. It's a direct result of Mr. Speak's time in Washington, D.C., in which he saw the improper use of data, the use of partial data, the use of emotional arguments and not data. So that's what the genesis of that is. Our judges tonight here, Dr. Enoch Hill, Assistant Professor of Economics, Dr. Theon Hill, Associate Professor of Communication, Dr. Timothy Taylor, Assistant Professor of International Relations, and Dr. Rebecca Sietman, Assistant Professor of Communications and Director of Forensics. She's our debate coach here. Tonight's debate topic is this: the United States federal government should prioritize stimulus money for citizens over business. The format will take approximately 45 minutes. We'll begin with an affirmative constructive speech lasting 7 minutes, a negative constructive speech lasting 7 minutes, an affirmative constructive speech number 2 for 7 minutes, a negative constructive speech number 2 for 7 minutes, cross-examination by our judges for 5 minutes, cross-examination by the debaters, 2 minutes on each side, a negative team rebuttal for 5 minutes, and finally an affirmative team rebuttal for 5 minutes. The students are, to my right, Olivia Christ, political science major, class of 2022, Collin Maldonado, philosophy IR major, class of 2023. To my left, arguing the negative position, Annie Rogers, a Bible and theology major, class of 2021, and Abby Wilson, international relations major, class of 2023. We will be announcing the winner via campus email as soon as the decision is reached. I should tell you also, finally, there is an incentive to winning tonight. The winners will receive $4,000, the runners-up $2,500 each. And without further ado, Heidi, that is it. Thank you for joining us.
All right, before I begin and before the timer starts, I would like to acknowledge and show my appreciation for everyone here tonight, for all of you that are here in person, and for everyone that is online. Thank you so much for your support. Particularly, I would like to thank our esteemed panel of judges for contributing your time to adjudicate this debate. I would like to thank the Center for Faith, Politics, and Economics for hosting this competition, and for our generous donor for providing the resources and making this possible. So thank you. I would also like to thank our admirable opponents, Annie and Abby, who are phenomenal debaters. And then lastly, I would like to thank my own partner, Collin Maldonado, who has not only been an insightful and intelligent person to work with, but someone who I have come to call a close friend. So thank you, Collin. All right, and with that, I will begin. Collin and I affirm that the United States should prioritize stimulus money for citizens over businesses. We'll argue that the round should be judged off of the following framework. Whichever side shows a more sustainable U.S. economy in the long term should win the round. Our first contention is stimulus supercharge. Amadeo from The Balance writes that consumer spending is the single most important driving force of the economy. Tori from the Wall Street Journal quantifies this claim, writing that, quote, U.S. consumer spending accounts for more than 2/3 of economic output. We'll note that the sudden drop in demand due to COVID restrictions is an inherently short-term scenario, and that this recession has proven Keynes' law, that demand drives supply in the short to medium term. Yet direct economic stimulus to individuals is beneficial for the U.S. economy not only in the short term, but in the long term as well. This is because there is clear evidence that individuals are spending their stimulus. In the short run, the economy is roaring back from the pandemic due to stimulus allocated to individuals. According to the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics, retail sales rose a whopping 5.3% in the first months of 2021, and total food and retail sales hit over $550 billion, their highest rate in over 3 years. Moreover, these stimulus checks are expected to supercharge economic growth overall, as the Bureau wrote that every sector of the economy showed gains, leading senior analyst at Goldman Sachs to forecast the economy to grow by an incredible 8%. Stimulus checks played a critical role in this effort. Robert Rosner, a premier economist at Morgan Stanley, attributes this current economic growth directly to consumer stimulus. The warrant is simple. Putting money in the hands of individuals allowed them to not only maintain their households to meet their basic needs during the pandemic, but the leftover cash has also given them excess money to spend as restrictions are lifted. Better yet, not only is the economy supercharged in the short term, it is also brought into better equilibrium in the long run. In a statement just 2 weeks ago, Jerome Powell, chairman of the Federal Reserve, stated that a transitory increase in inflation, a one-time jump of prices, driven by an increase in consumer spending, was necessary to meet the long-run target inflation rate of 2%. Moreover, Powell remarked that a long-run inflation rate at 2% is critical for achieving maximum employment. Davis from Investopedia explains this idea, writing that controlled inflation increases employment as consumers spend more on goods and services. Therefore, not only are stimulus checks beneficial in the immediate future, but they set the stage for a more sustainable economy in the long run. As such, economic stimulus to individuals is the linchpin for this key metric of health for the economy. However, prioritizing stimulus money to businesses would severely dampen this effect for one key reason: banks, which both act as middlemen and pick winners and losers. According to the Department of Treasury, nearly all banks could process business stimulus, leading them to charge anywhere from 1% to 5%. An NPR investigation found that this allowed banks to collectively make over $10 billion. Worse, the same investigation found that because private banks have an incentive to profit, they approved the largest loans first, the ones destined for larger corporations, leaving the smallest businesses, the ones that needed the loans the most, without aid. The Washington Post confirmed this in December, filing a Freedom of Information request that revealed that over half of business stimulus money went to just 5% of businesses. Our second contention, then, is sealing the cracks. While stimulus checks to the majority of Americans will help supercharge the economy, there is another critical use for them: delivering financial support to those who need it the most. The economic downturn caused by the pandemic hasn't fallen equally across all economic sectors. Mr. Powell, just 2 weeks ago, remarked that those least able to shoulder the burden have been the hardest hit. A poll by Pew Research Center in late 2020 found that half of adults who say they had lost a job due to the pandemic have yet to be reemployed. The Bureau of Labor Statistics nuances this further, writing that job loss has been overwhelmingly concentrated in low-wage service sector jobs, such as hospitality. This translates into real economic hardship for millions of Americans. According to the Census Bureau, the number of households who say they don't have enough to eat has grown by more than 2 million households. This is because for many Americans, jobless benefits are simply insufficient for meeting the needs of a household during an unprecedented time. Many individuals aren't covered by our current unemployment umbrella. Janet Yellen, the Secretary of Treasury, explicitly said that stimulus checks are an excellent tool to help those that don't receive jobless benefits, such as parents who left the workforce to care for their children, children who were and still are forced to be at home. Som from the Wall Street Journal furthers this idea, saying that, quote, 1/3 of families who lost employment income since March haven't received jobless benefits. For these households, stimulus money is a godsend. Barker from the University of Chicago noted that households with lower incomes and greater income drops due to payroll cuts spent upwards of 60% of their stimulus money within the first month. economists at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago quantified this heterogeneity in the marginal propensity to consume, writing roughly 2/3 of households living paycheck to paycheck spent their stimulus money within 2 weeks, while other households saved their money or paid down debt. Worse yet, Leonhardt at CNBC quantifies this further, saying that 63% of Americans have been living paycheck to paycheck since COVID hit. To conclude, we use the current data to argue two things. First, that prioritizing stimulus money to citizens during the pandemic best prepares the economy to not only grow in the short run, but to achieve sustainability in the long run as well. Second, a growing minority of individuals, people who fall through the bureaucratic cracks, need direct economic stimulus to survive. For these reasons, Collin and I affirmed the resolution and argued that the U.S. government should prioritize stimulus money to individuals. Thank you.
Before I begin, I just want to say thank you all for being here today. We appreciate your time and effort and to be helping us become better debaters and hopefully better people as well. So with that in mind, I'm going to start my timer in 3, 2, 1. Today, we are not here to discuss whether or not stimulus checks to businesses are bad and individual stimulus checks are good, or vice versa. Yet instead, we're asked to prioritize which one has a more immediate need. Today, what my partner Abby and I would like to tell you is that stimulus checks to businesses have a more immediate need and a greater benefit. Specifically, what we're going to be doing today through this speech is looking at 3 main points: the evaluation, prioritization, and the justification of prioritizing corporate stimulus checks. The most important thing I would like you to remember from this speech is that without stimulus checks to businesses, we have little hope for providing families with consistent income, preventing mass unemployment, and supporting jobs of marginalized people. And I'll be interspersing rebuttal throughout my speech. So let's look at the first point. The evaluation for the round is the revitalization of the economy, similar to what the affirmative team said. The best way for you to evaluate the arguments that you hear through the round is through the lens of revitalizing the economy. Specifically, ask yourselves, as you listen to the arguments, which ideas offered in this round do the best job of supporting a long-term, sustainable, and net beneficial reopening of the economy? My partner and I believe that using the revitalization of the economy is the best metric by which to judge the round because it takes into account both macroeconomic and microeconomic factors, i.e. how decreased unemployment rates aid low-wage families and small businesses. Essentially, we win both. We win our weighing mechanism and we win the weighing mechanism of the affirmative team by showing you that our plan helps businesses and individuals in the short term and in the long term. Secondly, we must understand the distinction between relief and stimulus. The Brookings Institute said on December of 2020 that, quote, relief provides support for the public to stay home while they've lost employment. The goal of relief is to reduce economic activity. In contrast, stimulus provides incentives for people to increase spending on work effort and businesses to increase hiring and investment. The goal of the stimulus is to raise economic activity, unquote. Individual stimulus checks put our economy in a coma that is no longer needed. Corporate stimulus checks increase much-needed activity, which leads me to my second point of prioritization. The resolution asks us to decide whether or not businesses or individuals should be prioritized. Which one needs to be in line first? Abby and I believe that businesses should be prioritized above individuals for stimulus checks because that avenue addresses the root cause of the problem we're in today, provides a more stable income for a larger amount of people in vulnerable groups, and prevents the most egregious impacts of mass unemployment, while individual stimulus does none of those things to that degree. The reason we are having this debate in the first place is because millions of Americans lost their job to the pandemic. So the best way to address immediate needs is to include people in the economy and give them their jobs back. When there is mass unemployment, we see cascading business failures, wasteful liquidations, plunging incomes, soaring unemployment, and little prospect for a rapid recovery. This is what happens without stimulus checks to businesses, which leads me to my third point of justification. That is, employment ensures income. We're going to be looking at 3 subpoints: the problem, the plan, and the product. First, the problem of mass unemployment. The Bureau of Labor Statistics revealed that in February of 2021, 13.3 million persons reported that they had been unable to work because their employer closed or lost business due to the pandemic. The National Bureau of Economic Research detailed that nearly 100,000 small businesses closed within the first 3 months of the pandemic. So what we see here in interaction with the affirmative team's last point of basic needs, the root cause of why people need money in the first place is not because they need aid from the government every time to time, but rather because there is mass unemployment because of the coronavirus pandemic. We also have to understand that checks only offer 1 or 2 payments a year, maybe a month, to individuals if they're lucky. However, when we look at corporate stimulus checks to businesses, we see that they're able to give them a more consistent form of income, which is why you should prefer corporate stimulus checks to help those basic needs. Also, we see that people are not starving because there is a lack of individual stimulus checks. There's a difference between use and need. None of the data which was presented by the affirmative team specifically stated that these people were specifically suffering because of a lack of $1,400 that came every 3 months or something. What we have to understand, though, is that there is data saying that people are specifically suffering because their jobs have been lost. We are able to solve for that very clear problem, which leads me to my next subpoint, and that is understanding that low-wage workers are still suffering. The Opportunity Insight study said that, quote, employment rates fell by 37% around the trough of the COVID recession for workers with wage rates in the bottom quartile of the pre-COVID wage distribution. By contrast, employment rates fell by 14% for those in the top wage quartile. Employment rates remain 20% below baseline levels for low-wage workers even as of October 2020. Low-wage workers are still suffering because of the pandemic, and spending due to individual stimulus checks will not help that, which leads me to my response of their main point, stimulus supercharge. Now, I want to analyze the evidence and the data that they presented you. They presented you with some nice data on why, in general, spending is good and helps the economy, and then they presented predictions of what people thought would happen with stimulus checks. But let's look at the data and the economic theories that tell us what actually happened when we provided individual stimulus checks. First of all, the argumentation upon which affirmative is talking about is inherently flawed because they're not taking into account the permanent income hypothesis. Developed by economists Robert Hall and Frederick Mishkin, the permanent income hypothesis states that consumers will alter the consumption by smaller amounts if they perceive the income change as temporary rather than permanent. Until consumers have a permanent fixed income, any increase in spending will only be temporary. And the data shows this as well. The Opportunity Insight studies tells us that individual stimulus checks spending failed to increase employment, did not undo initial spending reductions, and actually amplified the difference in small business revenue. It did not do what the affirmative team was promising it would, which leads us to subpoint C, the product. We do see a promise with corporate stimulus checks to businesses. In a December 2020 study, the Department of Treasury found that the Paycheck Protection Program covered 80% of eligible small businesses, supported 51 million American jobs, and saved roughly 13 to 17 million American jobs. Sure, the banks might have taken a lot from the corporate stimulus checks, and that's something to work on next time. But the data shows that it was still worthwhile because of all of the jobs it saved. The most important thing I want you to remember from this speech is that corporate stimulus checks can take care of both individual needs and long-term problems because they can decrease unemployment and get people back on their feet. Thank you so much for your time.
Before I begin, I would also like to offer a few thank yous. First to Olivia, who has been a really great partner and friend throughout the whole process. I would love to thank our generous donor for financing these debates, and to our panel of judges who have agreed to give up their time this evening to judge us. And finally, of course, to the Wheaton Center for Faith, Politics, and Economics for hosting these debates. I'd also like to briefly thank my friends and family who have listened to me talk about this topic for the past 4 months straight. Is everyone ready? I'm going to do a couple of things in this speech. First, I'm going to break it up into 2 parts. I'm going to talk about the problems with the PPP, and then even in the best case scenario, what would happen and why we should still prioritize individual stimulus checks. But before I begin, I would like to make an overarching observation about their case that really cannot be disregarded. is that, first of all, they want to say that we can have both, and they put a lot of emphasis on the word prioritize, but then in their data, or directly after that, they give you this big stark contrast between how there's little hope for employment if we decided to prioritize individual stimulus checks. And I'd also like to point out the fact that currently, we have done both, right? Like the US federal government can afford to do both. It has done both PPP funding and $1,400 stimulus checks to individuals. So what we will argue, and what Olivia argued, and what I will continue to argue throughout the debate, is that if it comes to tipping the scales in a certain direction, we should always tip them in the side that incentivizes demand, and that gets people out of their homes to spend money in small businesses, which will grow the economy both in the short term and in the long term. That's the side that should win the debate, because those are the people and those are the methods by which the economy will grow in the long term. I'd like to first talk about some of the problems with the PPP and how those really honestly won't get solved in the long term, and ultimately what that means for their case. Now, we see three major problems with this that Olivia points out. First of all is that big businesses really do have a propensity to just gobble up all the money. Why is that really problematic? Well, when an investigation by the Washington Post finds that 50% of money goes to 5% of businesses, that is inherently going to limit the scope of their impacts, especially when they're talking about small businesses and trying to have them stay open during the pandemic. When half of that money, over $240 billion, goes to 5% of companies, those impacts that they want to tell you, unfortunately, just do not manifest. I'd next like to talk about the banks. Abby comes up here and, Annie comes up here and tells you that the banks in the long term shouldn't be a problem. But we have a couple of reasons why banks will continue to be a problem in the long term, is that first, they do just skim off the top, right? Olivia comes up here and tells you that banks take $10 billion total off of the transaction. Why is that problematic? Well, one, it's going to soften the blow of any economic stimulus that does get flowing from Conn's side. So if we do prioritize money to businesses in the long term, you're going to see banks continue to make money off of this. Why is this problematic? Is because banks will inevitably soften the blow. So by routing stimulus money through the banks, you're not going to have the impacts that they want to tell you in the long term and over the greater amount, specifically because banks are taking the money and they're picking the biggest corporations. None of those impacts in terms of having money go to the individuals that really need it in the low-wage service sector jobs are going to manifest because these big businesses are taking up all of the money. And that leads me to a really stark contradiction in their case. Remember how I first told you at the beginning of their speech that the US federal government has afforded to do both? Take a look at the bottom of their case where they tell you a lot of the really negative impacts that have happened in the status quo. They like to point out specifically like the low-wage service sector jobs that have lost a ton of money. That actually supports our side almost entirely because currently PPP money was supposed to go to those individuals. If we saw PPP money working, then we wouldn't see those individuals unemployed. What we argue on affirmative is that yes, we can have some PPP money going to these businesses, but ultimately, in order to get these people re-employed, we need to stimulate demand. And we're the only side that does that most effectively because we're prioritizing money to people who will go out and spend it. They come up here and they tell you in their first constructive speech that a lot of the impacts that we are citing, specifically stimulus supercharge, for example, isn't exactly what happened. But I would just like to point out that the card and the source from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics was from this past month. Retail sales did grow in the first months of this year. And that kind of shows you like what exactly the stimulus checks are doing to the economy. They're getting people out the door. They're allowing people to go out and spend their money. I would next like to kind of move on to what happens in their best case scenario. So let's say that all of the issues in terms of the banks get fixed, and let's say even just all of the people who were unemployed previously, like somehow magically get reemployed. We still would honestly argue that our side does a better job of incentivizing demand for this reason. Because quite honestly, they are keeping the economy on life support because those individuals who are still employed are taking pay cuts, and the data that they cite with the PPP in action shows that those people are still losing jobs disproportionately because the banks are picking winners and losers. Now, how do we solve for this? Well, it comes down to this really clear narrative that we believe should win the round, is that we are incentivizing demand because we're giving money to people who will go out and spend it. And we believe that the best way to make up for these lost jobs in the service sector, which currently in the status quo, neither side has solved for. People have lost their jobs. People are going hungry. People do need money in their pockets. We believe that we do the better job of solving for that because we're incentivizing demand. We're getting people to go out to these restaurants and to make purchases. And at this point, I would like to add on to Olivia's case. And then an investigation by the Washington Post found that retail and food services have hit their highest point in 3 years. So what we're seeing now is that as the economy opens up, people are going out and spending their stimulus checks. Just this morning, Axios, in conjunction with the ISM, published a report saying that small business owners are the most optimistic they have ever been in the past 20 years. So from 1998 to 2021, a survey is conducted among small business owners, and just this morning, they said that they've been the most optimistic that they've ever been. And the key reason for their optimism, they said, was because individual stimulus checks are being shipped to people, which is driving their demand. So when you have the owners of small businesses saying specifically that individual stimulus checks are creating this demand, that is going to be a point that we believe is ultimately impacted out to our side. So when it comes down to collapsing the narrative, in which side has a better way to impact the people who need it the most, we believe that pro should always take the ballot, because we have a simpler way by which money is delivered to individuals who have an incentive to go out and spend it. On the con side, it's routed through the banks, it's disproportionately going to large businesses, and many people are slipping through the cracks, which we solve for in the short term and set up a better economy in the long term. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Not to sound a little redundant, but I would also like to say thank you. I know that getting off a day of work and then coming to judge debate is very mentally exhausting, especially since you guys are professors, already a job that uses your brain a lot. So thank you for being here, and thank you to the debaters. So if everyone's ready, I will get started. So good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight or for watching tonight. We really appreciate you. In my speech, I will be detailing how stimulus money to businesses can help both businesses and workers through an analysis of the service industry. Furthermore, by the end of my speech, you will know how stimulus money to businesses can address the needs of individuals in a way that citizen stimulus checks cannot. There will be two main points, restaurants and employment, which will each have multiple subpoints. I want to quickly address just a bit of refutation, but you'll hear the rest of the refutation in my speech. You heard a lot of problems with the PPP. We just want to reaffirm that PPP has been shown to increase employment by multiple studies. That Department of Treasury found that it covered 80% of eligible small businesses, so it did cover a lot of people and saved roughly 13 to 17 million American jobs. NBER, the National Bureau of Economic Research, found that there are increasing effects over time, so we may not even see the full effects of the PPP, and that future stimulus will be more effective. According to the National Restaurant Association, many of their concerns have been met with the PPP, such as they're going to be broadening who's eligible for it, broadening what they can spend it on. So a lot of the harms that we've seen in the past, first of all, PPP is effective. Second of all, that many of these harms will be mitigated in the future. Also, they're saying that the PPP wasn't effective because people are still struggling. We say this is not unique because people already received stimulus checks and are still struggling with that. And the fact about incentivizing demand, particularly, we want to point to their getting people to go restaurants point, because we're going to talk about restaurants and talk about how business stimulus actually helps them more. So my first point is restaurants. So I'll discuss the problem, which is the harms that restaurants are facing, and then I will briefly address the cause of these problems and compare solutions, including why my opponent's proposed solution is inadequate. So first of all, the problem. This is the first detail I'd like to analyze with you. It's potentially irreversible and definitively severe harms that the restaurant industry is facing as a result of COVID. According to the National Restaurant Association, in December of 2020, 17% of American restaurants either closed permanently or long-term. Restaurants employed 3.1 million less people than they were expected to, and only 48% of closed restaurants plan to reopen. We heard in the previous speech that small business owners are more optimistic than ever, but we're actually seeing that only 52% of these businesses plan to re-enter the industry. This data shows that once restaurants collapse, millions of people lose jobs, and it is often unlikely for businesses to return, leading to long-term losses of unemployment. Now we'll look at different causes and solutions for this problem. Many of these closures are due to COVID restrictions that implement limited dining capacities.
We might think takeout menus or prematurely opening restaurants, but a survey conducted by the Golden Gate Restaurant Association found that 87% of restaurants cannot survive on just takeout and delivery. We also saw the CDC release a statement last month saying that on-premise restaurant dining led to an increase in COVID cases. And additionally, profit increases from individual stimulus checks have very short-lived effects. The Gordon Haskett Research Advisors found that restaurants did see an increase in sales after the first stimulus check, but that this increase lasted only around 1 week. So we do see effects from the stimulus checks, but they are in no way long-lasting, particularly in the restaurant industry. American workers need jobs to come back to the weighing mechanism of a sustainable economy. American jobs need to exist so that people can come back to them. If we simply sustain citizens in the short term, but don't also sustain their key sources of employment, we do them a disservice in the long term. In order to protect these workers, we must protect their jobs, and the most logical solution we have remaining is giving stimulus money to businesses directly. So this will lead us to our second major point, which is the unique importance of employment. And so I have 3 subpoints for this overarching point of employment. The first of which being a framework for who has been most affected by the pandemic. We talked a lot about low-wage workers, who needs this money most. We're going to be addressing that. The second being undocumented immigrants, and the third being unbanked households. So the first being a framework. Both the service industry and the pandemic disproportionately involve minorities. According to the Brookings Institute in December 2020 study, Black, Hispanic, Native American, and Asian American workers have experienced some of the highest increases in unemployment rates. Also, the U.S. National Library of Medicine talks about how minorities are represented in 60% of these service jobs, and half of immigrants in the U.S. work in service or blue-collar jobs. If the service industry collapses, it will disproportionately affect minorities and immigrants, so we need to be able to protect their jobs. So after showing you this importance, we're saying we want to support minorities, low-wage workers, those who have been affected most by the pandemic. And now we're going to look about, first of all, our side solves for that because we're supporting the service industry that employs them. But we also want to show you unique aspects of employment that we can solve for that the other side cannot. This being undocumented immigrants. Not only are immigrants essential to these industries, but more specifically, 18% of undocumented immigrants work in the hospitality and tourism industries. Undocumented immigrants are valuable just through their innate worth and dignity as people, but they are also an important component of our economy, both through employment and through taxes. According to the U.S. Committee on the Judiciary and the White House Council of Economic Advisors, undocumented immigrants contribute to our economy and raise the GDP annually by $37 billion. Undocumented immigrants do pay taxes, but they cannot access U.S. safety nets and welfare. More specifically for this debate, undocumented immigrants were ineligible for the CARES Act stimulus check because they did not have social security numbers. And this is why we need to look at specifically supporting businesses, specifically these industries that are on the verge of collapse, because it is an essential part of kickstarting and supporting our economy. Undocumented immigrants will benefit from our side of stimulus payments to businesses, but they will be mostly excluded from stimulus checks to citizens. And helping undocumented immigrants is inherently beneficial because of their value as people, but it also helps our economy through sustaining valuable GDP contributions. And the best way to do this is to support the industries that are on the verge of collapse and empower them to retain their employees. The third point being unbanked households. Additionally, Black and Latinx workers have been disproportionately hurt by the pandemic and uniquely benefit from stimulus money to businesses. Supporting employment rather than stimulus checks is particularly important as, according to the Center for American Progress, approximately 17% of Black households and 14% of Latinx households are unbanked, which means that they will have to wait weeks or months to receive a paper check from the federal government. So for many Americans, including minorities who have been most affected by this pandemic, individual stimulus checks will not come to them, and if they do eventually, it will be too long to get these short-term needs that they need. And so we're looking at sustaining their employment is the most beneficial way for them to be able to receive these benefits. On our side, individuals will benefit from stimulus money to businesses in both the short and long term, as stimulus can better enable businesses to retain their employees. So I've given you lots of data in the past 6 minutes, so I'm just going to give you a bit of a summary of what are the important things to remember from our position. In this speech, we've shown you how desperately service industry businesses need stimulus, and that without corporate stimulus checks, many businesses will close their doors and never reopen, leading to a long-term loss of a crucial source of employment. We've outlined the inadequacies of alternative solutions, such as takeout, individual stimulus checks. We've outlined the inadequacies of those in order to highlight our need to prioritize business stimulus. We've also shown you how our side uniquely solves for many of those who have been most affected by the pandemic. Stimulus checks to businesses will help undocumented immigrants and help unbanked households in a way that individual stimulus checks cannot. And for all these reasons, I'm so proud to support stimulus money to businesses. Thank you for your time and attention.
All right, I believe it is time for the questioning period, so whenever you guys are ready, I'm ready.
Yes, Olivia. First question I have for the affirmative team is, in your first speech, you talked about some of the long-term benefits to the economy and focused primarily on inflation, on the inflation rate. Could you maybe expand on some of the long-term benefits to the economy beyond just inflation rate?
Right. Ultimately, I think it had to do with the consumer spending aspect of it, because we can't keep people employed if people aren't driving demand, or if there isn't anything incentivizing demand. So when we give individuals stimulus checks, they're able to go out to businesses and consume, and we've seen that there have been gains in every single economic sector. So it's not only good that we'll have this transitory inflation rate that will help take our economy to like this long-term evened out equilibrium, but it also will help so that we can get people reemployed. And it's kind of, rather than just giving PPP money to businesses, which we have shown is not effective, we're allowing people to be reemployed or kind of stimulate businesses as well through individual paychecks, which leads to long-term growth.
Thank you. I have a question concerning stimulus payments. One core part of the argument was that the stimulus payments are meant to stimulate demand, in particular through consumption.
Right.
So how would you respond to the fact that one of the top categories of expenditure for those receiving stimulus checks was in the purchase of stocks and investment?
I think that overall, like, first of all, going back to our evidence that shows that there were economic gains, we think that it's still okay that those are going to stocks and investments as well because of the economic gains we have seen. So maybe not all of the money has gone there, but we think that the amount that has gone to all economic sectors, and we've seen the increase in spending at restaurants and businesses. Retail sales rose 5.3%. Even if a large portion is going to stocks and investments by people who are able to put their money in those places, we've still seen gains in other areas. Any other questions? I wasn't keeping time, but.
So I was curious about why your side chose to focus exclusively on stimulus checks as opposed to unemployment insurance and other payments that are directly to individuals that are not through universal stimulus checks.
I think it was basically just on the way that we read the resolution to be. I think we saw stimulus to individuals as the stimulus checks that were handed out. So that's, I think, why we didn't choose to look at other things. But I'm sure Collin can expand on that in his other speech, and he has other evidence that's probably going to further address some of the questions you brought up as well. All right, thank you, guys.
I'll start with the first question.
I'm ready whenever you guys are.
All right, great. Inevitably, some people are going to be unemployed through the pandemic. How should we think about assistance to those? Both sides seem to have conceded that a desire to return to employment is a good objective. But how should we think about care for those who have become unemployed?
Absolutely. I think on side opposition, the best way we can focus on caring for those individuals who are still unemployed or who have methods like they're a family caregiver, et cetera, they're just not in the economy in the way that normal stimulus checks would aid them. I think the best way we can focus on helping them is, in fact, through those programs like unemployment benefits, like SNAP, like temporary assistance to needy families, like the ban on evictions. Again, those are things that are imperfect in the system and need to be bolstered, but we really believe that's going to happen on either side of the house. And so the best way we can care for them is growing the economy as a whole to ensure that as they interact with the economy, they're able to get the best benefits out of it as possible. Because if jobs are failing, then that's inevitably going to affect consumers, even if they aren't directly employed in the economy.
So this is an interesting point that was brought up in both cross-examinations. How should we think, with respect to the resolution, the supplemental addition to weekly unemployment benefits? Are both sides in agreement of how we should do this?
I believe that from the beginning of this journey for data-driven debates, I think all teams were kind of in agreement that we focused on stimulus checks to businesses and corporations, individuals, essentially as a direct check or a direct loan, and that we were not going to consider unemployment benefits, SNAP, temporary assistance, et cetera, as stimulus checks. I think that's just the way that most of the teams decided to interpret it early on in the season.
Okay, so I'm trying to look at kind of balancing or weighing out some of the evidence provided by the affirmative side that suggests that huge amounts of money are going to banks. The banks are making a lot off of it. And yet, your side argues that there are people who are not getting the stimulus checks that are somehow benefiting from the money that goes to business. Could you explain a little bit more about how we can have confidence that people are actually seeing the benefits of the small amount of money that at least they characterize as small amount of money going to the active businesses who need it, as opposed to just making the banks bigger? Could you just kind of interact with that evidence and how that clashes?
Absolutely. I think the way we can see that impact is through the data. So in December of 2020, as I mentioned in my first speech, the Department of Treasury found that the Paycheck Protection Program, in spite of its imperfections, covered 80% of eligible small businesses and supported 51 million American jobs and saved 13 to 17 million American jobs. So is it imperfect? Absolutely. Should we seek to better it? Absolutely. Did it still work and support 13 to 17 million American jobs? Yes. And so we see the impact on the opposition side of the House. So we should always weigh when we look at the impact, and we believe that the impact of helping those 13 to 17 million jobs, and thus giving those 13 to 17 million people more employment, more consistent forms of employment, should outweigh any fears that banks are using this money or getting too much of this money. That's something that should be solved, but it's not a reason to avoid stimulus checks to businesses.
If there's time for a follow-up, I'm not looking at the time. How would you characterize that then in light of Abby's argument and data to suggest that we need, money specifically going to these restaurants, right? Like how do we sort of quantify the amount of these jobs that we're saving or getting? Like how do we see how that part of this, does this make sense? How does it interact with, okay, it's not perfect, but how many of these jobs are we keeping? Or to what extent are we able to keep and grow jobs in these sectors that need the most, like the restaurant industry, in contrast? Do you understand my question? Essentially,
are you asking how we're able to measure and quantify future effects of the PPP or similar programs like it?
Well, even right now, yeah, and going forward, both. So, what are we seeing right now? How are we helping the restaurant industry specifically that's been hard hit, and these people who don't have access to stimulus? What are effects we seeing right now? And is there evidence suggesting where that's heading?
Sure. So there's not a lot of evidence for how restaurant sectors are benefiting from stimulus checks to them right now, just because we're currently living in it. So I think what we have to go off of is the need. First of all, the past precedent that PPP has been shown to be very effective in protecting these jobs. And also in terms of vulnerability, right? There's a whole group of people who won't benefit at all from stimulus checks to individuals. So that's how I would quantify it.
Time.
And then I believe it's cross-ex of the team, correct? Olivia, congratulations on making it to finals. I just have a couple questions for you today. First of all, on your data that you presented in your first speech. Now, could you tell me the date of the study from your first contention that said that individual stimulus checks would boost spending in almost all sectors?
I don't have the direct date with me right now. I know that Collin does, so he can provide that in his next speech if you would like that, although I know all of our data is very recent, like beginning of 2021, so very recent data.
Okay, thank you. And now, was that specifically stating that individual stimulus checks over a long period of time would increase spending, or was that specifically referencing the months of March, April, and May? I remember hearing April in there, so I just want to make sure I'm hearing you right.
Right. Most of the economic growth or that transitory increase we talked about happened directly after people got their checks, right? We show that a large portion of people who received their checks spent within 2 weeks of them getting their checks. So it did happen right away, but we think that ultimately that is a good thing because of the way it will lead to our overall equilibrium with the inflation that I talked about in my speech, and as well leading to overall economic growth by incentivizing demand.
Sure. So how would you reconcile that claim with the Census Bureau data that said that only 26% of people who received stimulus checks spent it? If only 26% of those people spent their stimulus checks, how was it able to somehow sustain the whole economy for years to come?
Right, and I think you have to go to our data that says that 2/3 of households spent their paychecks within the within the first 2 weeks, and that from CNBC, 63% of people are living paycheck to paycheck. So those who are spending it are the ones who need it the most, which is showing that while PPP is still happening, those people aren't receiving it. So they need money, and if they spent it directly, that really sheds light on the immediate need. And if PPP is currently happening but not affecting those people, that shows that individual stimulus is needed, and that's why we should prioritize it over PPP. Both are happening, but unfortunately, there's still 50% of people who were unemployed at the start of this and remain unemployed, which is showing that PPP is ineffective for those low service sector jobs, which I think are the people that we both agree we're trying to take care of in this debate and with this resolution.
Is that time?
All right, thank you, Annie. My first question is, with the data I just gave you, seeing that the Pew Research Center finds that 50% of people still have yet to be reemployed, how are you incentivizing businesses to rehire these people, the people that you claim PPP is helping but have yet to be reemployed?
Sure. So I think it's kind of a wash on both sides, right? If we say that individuals have benefited from stimulus checks, they're really great, but they still need them, we can't then argue that PPP has been in effect, and thus we've seen it fail because people are still unemployed. Like, both sides say that there's still a need. And so I think what it boils down to is looking at past precedent, right? There's not a lot of data showing exactly how stimulus checks were able to meet those immediate needs, just that people spent it. Again, difference between need versus use. While on the other hand, we have data from December of 2020 saying that the PPP, in spite of its imperfections, supported 80% of eligible small businesses and saved 13 to 17 million American jobs. I think the impacts are outweighed pretty nicely there.
Well, if we're looking at long-term economic growth, I don't really think that, although we are solving for need, we think that use is okay because it's leading to economic growth, the growth that we've seen in every single sector. So how do you actually incentivize demand with PPP when it's happening on our side, even if it is use instead of need? It's allowing our economy to flourish and grow, even if people who don't need it are spending.
Sure. So I think, first of all, opposition would fundamentally disagree that it's been able to increase consumer demand and spending over time, right? The Opportunity Insight study, which was finished in November 2020, reported that individual stimulus spending failed to increase employment. It did not undo initial spending reductions and actually amplified the difference in small business revenue. So we would say that when we're looking at a long-term solution, the best solution is to give people a consistent and reliable source of income. Again, going back to the permanent income hypothesis, people aren't going to just keep on spending if they don't have a reliable source of income. The best way to give them a reliable source of income is through employment rates.
Right. Thank you. I think that's time.
Thank you.
All right, hi again. Is everyone ready? Okay. So in the next 5 minutes, I'm going to be providing a bit of weighing, a bit of refutation, just kind of giving you a summation of the debate and why we think that we've won. So we're going to look at the impact, sort of what is the end result of the two plans that we are proposing to you, and what are the end results that we think are most likely to happen, and what will be the best results for both businesses and for workers. So we're going to first look at the opposition side of the impacts that they have. First of all, being the financial support to those who need it most. We think that we can absorb this by saying that we solve this better, by addressing unbanked and undocumented people who actually need this financial support and wouldn't otherwise be receiving it. So we think that we do actually also provide this financial support. And furthermore, you heard from Annie that it reduces the stratification between rich and poor workers, as poor people were more likely to lose their jobs. And so by being able to provide employment and reinstill that and reinstate it, that we're actually reducing the stratification between the rich and the poor by equalizing it and providing more employment. There also was a point of problems with the PPP. First of all, we want to say that neither side has really reached a solution. Neither side has really been able to solve the economy yet. So saying that the PPP has failed isn't necessarily saying that it's something to be avoided in the future. So neither side has really solved this. We see that as a bit non-unique. But we also want to affirm that we actually argue that the PPP has been effective. First of all, citing the Department of Treasury that it saved roughly 13 to 17 million American jobs. So there's sort of this prevention of it saving these jobs. But also an MIT economics study found that this boosted employment at eligible firms by 2 to 4.5% and increased aggregate U.S. employment by 1.4 to 3.2 million jobs. So it saved 13 to 17 million, and it was able to increase employment as well, found by MIT. So we're seeing that actually the PPP actually was proven to be effective, and also that future plans are going to be improving. There are different plans besides for the PPP. We see a lot of, with the American Rescue Plan, that there's new funds for restaurants, and that actually these are a lot less strict, and so we're seeing actually future plans are actually going to be proven to be more effective because they're constantly adapting. So we're seeing that this plan actually does save jobs, it has increasing effects over time, and that the future stimulus will be even more effective than before. So we'd actually argue that these loans actually have been effective, and they have been beneficial to the economy, and that we will continue to see the benefits of this. We also want to address the point of incentivizing demand. We would argue that it has not incentivized demand. We actually see that demand decreased because of a combination of decreased income and because of restrictions. And the Census Bureau data proves this, that in the first month of the pandemic, 70% of people who received their stimulus checks either used it to pay off debts or they saved it. That only 26% of people who received stimulus checks spent it, and most of them put it towards debt or saved it. So this is back to this permanent income hypothesis. We're arguing on this framework that people aren't going to change their spending habits unless they have this almost guaranteed future income, that employment's actually going to further drive demand, because it's hard to get $1,400 and say I'm going to go spend it, but I'm not sure where my next paycheck is going to come from. That if we actually want to be able to benefit across all sectors, we want to have this guaranteed income through employment, and we think that our side best solves for unemployment. We also see, according to Opportunity Insights, the stimulus substantially increased total consumer spending, but it didn't directly undo the initial spending reductions by returning money back to the businesses that lost the most revenue. So spending from the stimulus checks didn't actually address the areas that needed it most. So we're seeing that actually it does not drive demand, but even if it does, it's not going towards the sectors that need it, and that employment would actually better drive demand. So we've seen that financial support to those who need it from the other side, we are also doing this and we are solving it better. That problems with these loans, that neither side has solved this, but that the loans actually are effective. And also that incentivizing demand, we think that employment actually better incentivizes demand, and that stimulus checks haven't done as good of a job as incentivizing this, as you've heard. So after we've gone through their impacts, we're going to look at sort of what our side is saying. Our side is saying that we're trying to prevent mass employment and save millions of jobs of people who need it most. That we're preventing larger companies from taking over rural areas and forcing workers into worse working conditions, and that it reduces the stratification between rich and poor. So we're really arguing on the basis of trying to reduce mass unemployment in order to revitalize and reinstate our economy in order to be able to help workers. That we're preventing irreversible business closure, therefore preventing long-term job losses. That if people get money in the short term, but we allow businesses to fail, that they may never return and those jobs may not return as quickly as we need them to. We're not able to continually pump in the stimulus money, and that business closures are very economically expensive. That when businesses close and we have those empty buildings that people are no longer using, who's taking care of that? That's the government. So we're actually seeing that businesses closing is more it's more of a financial strain on the government than being able to sustain these businesses, and that our side is able to uniquely provide money to people who need this financial support, that we uniquely provide that to them in the way that the other side does not, through undocumented immigrants and through unbanked households. So for all these reasons, I'm proud to oppose. Thank you.
Is everyone ready? Let's begin. In this speech, I'm going to go over the two key points on which the round we believe should be judged, and then get into a comparative weighing analysis, which is just our world versus their world. So I'd like to get into the first main point, which is the service industry. I'd like to zero in on a point that was conceded in crossfire by the opposition team, is that inevitably jobs are going to be lost. And they would argue that the PPP has, one, protected those jobs, and more PPP money would ensure that those jobs are protected at a greater rate. But look at the data that they cite. They tell you that 17% of restaurants have permanently closed, and 52% of them don't plan to reopen. Yet this is occurring in a world where PPP funding is happening. And we argue that in order to incentivize those restaurants to open, to ensure that people go out and spend that money, we need to stimulate demand, which I'll be getting to as my second point. I'd like to zero in on the data that they use to tell us that people aren't spending that money, and this is really important. In fact, I think that this is the most important part of this round. The data that they cite from the Census Bureau and the National Bureau of Economic Research comes from December, and it comes from August. That is talking about the first wave of stimulus checks. When it's talking about, it's specifically discussing what people did with that first wave. So a survey by the Bernberg Bank found that in the first round, people did pay down debt, and people did save their money. Now, why is that important? It's because people did that in May and in June when they didn't know how long the pandemic is going to last. And ultimately, that we believe that this is a great argument for showing why we should continue to prioritize stimulus checks to people. It's because after that first round, after they've paid down that debt, with a second round of stimulus money, that's when they're going out and spending that money. And that's how we incentivize demand, with reoccurring stimulus payments to individuals. And here's where we outweigh on timeliness, is because the Washington Post card that Olivia comes up here and tells you is coming from the first couple months of 2021. Why is that important? Because that's after the second round of stimulus money has gone out. That's showing you that people used the money that they saved, and with this additional money, they are incentivized to go out and spend their money. So on this point specifically, you want to examine at what point the data is talking about. The data that they cite is coming from December, and it's coming from August, talking about the first round of payments. The data that we cite is an excellent example of why we should continue to prioritize stimulus money to individuals, because that second payment is what is cementing the desire to go out and spend money. That is this payment that is incentivizing demand, and ultimately the reason why we should tip the scales in favor of the affirmative side. This gets me to the second point about demand. They come up here and they tell you that without PPP, we're going to lose billions of jobs. And I have a really important weighing point to make here, is that we're not arguing for a world without PPP. We're arguing for a world with PPP, but a world where we incentivize demand more by emphasizing individual stimulus checks. So all of the evidence that they cite about the jobs they saved, we can have that in our world. But remember what was conceded in Cross, is that jobs are still lost at the end of the day. The jobs are lost, they conceded from their data, in service sector jobs and economies. And there are two warrants for this, right? Is that one, in a pandemic, in an unprecedented time where you don't have people coming in and sitting down, you just aren't going to need as many workers. The warrant is really simple. So how are you going to hire those workers back? In their world, it's additional money to restaurants and businesses. That's not going to incentivize them to hire people back. What will incentivize restaurants and businesses to hire people back is a big surge of demand when people have this extra pocket change and they come in and spend their money. Now, they tell you that this is just a transitory one-time increase in spending. But recognize what the Bernberg Bank tells you is that because people have paid down their debt, they have more spending money in the long term. They talk about the permanent income hypothesis and say that it's just a one-time increase in demand that doesn't change spending habits in the long term. But recognize that doesn't apply, specifically because of what the Bernberg Bank tells you about those individuals paying down their debt with the first round of stimulus money. At this point, I would like to address a question that Dr. Taylor brought up in Crossfire. He said that the majority of stimulus checks now have been funneled towards investment and towards stocks. And we argue that, well, the fact of the matter is that even if that is true, which we argue that it isn't over 50%, that is still giving people spending power in the long term. That's an example of how people are using their stimulus money to ensure that they have more income in the long term. So lastly, I would like to get into a comparative weighing analysis. So on our side, in the macro, Jerome Powell tells you that we need this transitory increase in inflation. And Axios tells you the small businesses are the most optimistic they've ever been because of individual stimulus checks. In the micro world, we're able to re-employ the people who need it the most, like undocumented immigrants, because we are driving demand, something that the pro side uniquely does. Thank you.
Thank you, Abby and Annie, Collin, and Olivia. Thank you so much. That was fantastic. And the judges are going to take a break now, and they're going to confer, and we'll have their results as soon as possible. But we just want to thank you, and thank you, Mr. Speak, for making this all possible for 4 years in a row. Wheaton College thanks you. That concludes this evening's activities. Thank you.